Okay, good evening, everybody. I think we're going to make a start now. Welcome to the East Midlands Energy Institute. And tonight's meeting is going to be a mixture of presentations from two people from Leicester University, followed by the annual general meeting of the East Midlands branch. Just for your information, there are two people, actually four people in the room listening for real, if you like, physically. And there are several people online as well, so it's a hybrid meeting. And my thanks to Leicester University for hosting us physically and virtually, and allowing us to record the session, which will later on be posted on the Energy Institute website. So after the presentations, and in fact during the presentations, if you have any questions for either Alice or Sandra Lee, Dr. Sandra Lee, who are our presenters, you can either raise a virtual hand and ask the question in real time, or you can type your question into the chat, which you should find via a link at the bottom of the screen, and I will read them out at the end of the talk. So two ways to ask questions, really. So tonight's session then will help you to understand the context of carbon reductions and what climate change means to you personally and at the workplace, why you should be taking steps to reduce your emissions, and how to access support for doing that. So as I mentioned before, we've got two presenters, Alice Jackson and Dr. Sandra Lee. Alice is a sustainability professional working to deliver on the Education for Sustainable Development strategy at the University of Leicester. She has worked on the development and teaching of an interdisciplinary sustainable enterprise module to connect students with local SMEs in order to create lasting sustainable impact, and has recently been recognised for this work at the 2022 Green Gown Awards. She has also developed and delivered carbon literacy training to over 200 staff, students and local businesses as an accredited carbon literacy facilitator. And Alice is going to be our first speaker, and she's the lady you can see on the screen. After her talk, Dr. Sandra Lee will speak, and she has almost 20 years experience delivering sustainability and behaviour change education and interventions. With one foot in academia and the other in real-world applications, she has a pragmatic approach to the change management required to help us avoid the worst effects of climate change, whilst also adapting to live with the inevitable by facilitating sustainability innovation and encouraging infrastructure changes. So as well as the recording of the event, we're going to share the slides when they've been finalised and turned into a PDF, probably next week sometime. So with that out of the way, I will hand over to Alice. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction. Here's another picture of our faces alongside our faces that hopefully aren't too giant on the screens, as it normally is when you do hybrid meetings. But it's nice to be here. Thank you for having us. We're just going to go over a couple of different things for this session. This is something that we've run with businesses external to the university over the past year. We've sort of molded it a little bit for the audience today. We're going to go through a little bit of a background on sort of carbon literacy and some of the terms, what you can do to reduce your emissions, and then a bit about some sort of further information, how you can access support that the university can provide you as well. We do want this to be interactive, so we've got a couple of chances to put things in the chat for a couple of sort of open questions throughout. As I say, we're also happy to kind of have questions as we go through as well, and we've got a little bit of time for questions at the end and discussions. So jumping right into it, I will start with covering a little bit of the basics of carbon literacy in terms of a bit of background. I'm going to go over some terminology and think about some sort of examples, and then think about this in the East Midlands context, because I believe with the East Midlands Energy Institute today, so we've used Leicester as an example of that. And I suppose the big why of why we are talking about carbon literacy today is climate change, really. So our planet's already warmed up 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and we need to stay within 1.5 degrees to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, really. And action to address this needs to happen now, and it needs to happen at an organisational level. And there's also things that individuals can do for this as well, which we will come on to as we go through. And it's useful, I think, to have that as the sort of big why of the carbon literacy. So to go through firstly, which I think is really useful for any of these sessions to go through jargon. So I'm aware a lot of people here are sort of professionals in industry, and we still think it's important to go over a little bit of basic jargon because everybody tends to have different definitions of these things as well. So for the purposes of this, we have used these definitions, like I say, in trainings that we've done with SMEs in the area, and also that we use internally in the university. So to go over these at the start, I think is really important. So firstly, what do we mean by carbon? So you'll see it written there as it is CO2e, which is, you may be familiar with, carbon dioxide equivalent, basically a way to show all of the greenhouse gases as one common unit. So carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide and F gases, and these make up the greenhouse effect, which is essentially warming our planet. There's a number of different human activities that cause these: fossil fuel, deforestation, livestock, things like air conditioning, fridges and hairspray will ring a bell for those in the 1980s that remember that ozone depleting gases used in these as well. And essentially a way to measure those is a carbon footprint. So that's a way to measure the amount of greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere as a result of our activities. So we can calculate the carbon footprint of anything, of individuals, of products, businesses, countries. Now that's not an exact science, but there's a thought process and an understanding for how to do that. So for example, we know the average carbon footprint of a person in the UK per year is 13 tonnes of CO2e in terms of what they consume. We can also see from various sort of tools, for example, Zeller shows that the average carbon footprint of an SME is 20 tonnes of CO2e a year in England. And as you can imagine, that differs depending on the type of business. So manufacturing tends to be maybe over 50 tonnes. There's a lot of businesses that are sort of smaller than that. So you can see kind of what sort of things go into that. We also do have a link, which maybe Sandra can put in the chat, or I can put in the chat after, for completing your own carbon footprint, which is also really useful when you see all of the numbers of carbon footprints in tonnes. To put that into context, it's useful to have done your own carbon footprint. So there's a WWF calculator, thank you Sandra, in the chat that might be useful for you to do. So then what does it mean to be carbon neutral? And this is where there's a lot of differing definitions. You can hear of a business sort of declaring that they're carbon neutral when they keep a balance of emitting carbon from things like facilities and electricity that a business uses, balanced with absorbing carbon from the atmosphere at the same rate. So things like technology or natural sources like trees that will then absorb carbon. So that's how you can essentially balance that out and declare that you're carbon neutral. But the difference here is, in order to be net zero, and we, as I say, have defined this for the purpose of the training that we use with businesses and internally at the university, a business must first focus on reducing emissions as much as possible in all areas. So it's not just direct emissions from facilities, but it's indirect emissions too, things like supply chain and business travel. Really, it is in your gift to sort of define what your commitment will be, what net zero commitments will be. So you'll find that organisations measure this differently on what will sort of be within their net zero commitment. So it's important to look at that. But as with any residual emissions after that sort of initial reduction are taken out of the atmosphere or absorbed. So that's how you can declare still that you're sort of net zero. As you can imagine, like I say, everybody sort of defines it differently, and the scope of the emissions is still much wider than a carbon neutral because it's beyond your direct emissions. It takes a lot longer to achieve net zero commitments. A lot of businesses have 10 or 20 years ahead of now as their sort of net zero commitment. And something that we will talk about a little bit further into the session as well is offsetting. So this kind of process of absorbing carbon is offsetting. And it's important to understand, I think, at this stage that it should be treated as a last option, that you need to be very careful with any sort of schemes that you invest in to ensure that they're kind of credible, certified, that they're ideally supporting local communities with projects that are beneficial to the environment as well. And it's not just a sort of pay to offset scheme. So there's a lot of different things that a business has to really carefully consider when it comes to being carbon neutral or being net zero, or how to sort of achieve these targets and what goes into them. Like I say, we'll come back to offsetting later, but maybe Sandra can also put the principles of the Oxford principles of offsetting into the chat as a useful source for that. And I think it's also worth noting, just lastly at this stage, that it's important to put all of those definitions and all of that understanding into the context of sustainability as well. So while we're talking about sort of carbon and these things, sustainability in general interconnects environmental, economic and social understandings as well. And where there's a lot of legislation that mainly targets carbon, and it's important to think about that in a wider understanding of sustainability and social impact of our actions and of businesses as well. So you can see here globally, a high proportion of our emissions come from carbon dioxide, largely due to sort of industry and energy and transport. And then methane is the second highest one in terms of global contributor to the greenhouse gases. And that's largely due to things like the meat industry and food waste as well. And I've pulled out this other sort of complementary figure that I sometimes use, as I thought it was interesting to share as we are at the Energy Institute today. And it sort of shows, with energy being such a high area where our emissions are coming from globally, it sort of shows how important it is for things like this and for energy to be a part of that conversation. And there's a lot more information on our World in Data there, which is a really good sort of source for looking at constantly updated things. I just think it's very interesting to consider how important energy is and how important it is, as I say, to be part of that conversation. And then in the UK, so more locally here, this is a breakdown of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. So they haven't done a nice image like this since 2019, so I'm using this one still, but the figures are very largely the same. Transport is still the highest emitter of carbon in the UK. There was a small drop in 2020 due to the pandemic. But from a business perspective, really, business travel and energy supply for buildings are part of those transport and energy figures. So you can see those are two kind of big areas in terms of quick wins and thinking about businesses on a whole and individuals of where we can sort of take action to reduce. Transport and energy are still the highest ones. So you can see a lot of stuff happening in the chat, and I've not had a look at it, but thank you, Sandra, I can see you mentioned stuff. I have got an activity here next. It would be useful if you can pop in the chat. Maybe one of you guys who's in the room can take a consensus and put something into the chat there. It's just a quick activity to look at an example in terms of carbon footprints and which activities have the most. So if we're looking at these three varieties of tomatoes for a food-based activity, you've got large salad variety grown locally and in-season tomatoes. You've got organic vine tomatoes grown in the UK in a heated greenhouse in March, and you've got baby plum tomatoes either in the UK summer or coming over from Spain in winter. If the figures for each of these three different types of tomatoes include all of the carbon footprint it takes to grow them, to harvest them, the travel to the shelf, and all of the packaging as well, which of these do you think has the highest carbon footprint? So those of you that are joining online, if you could just pop that in the chat, and then if you could take a consensus from the room and pop it in the chat, that would be useful. On instinct, just take a quick guess. One for baby plum. Any more guesses? I would say from doing this before, a lot of people say baby plum. It's coming over from Spain, considering the amount of sort of travel there. Let me get it on there. The answers are quite shocking. That so while you might have considered, I guess, that potentially the organic one might be highest, like yeah, a couple of people have put in there. It's quite shocking, I think, the actual numbers. So you can see at the bottom there, the organic vine cherry tomatoes are 28.2 kilograms of CO2e per, I think it's kilogram of tomatoes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so remembering, I guess, that the heated greenhouse in the UK in March is using energy that's it's using energy to heat it. It's not using natural sources to heat. Normally when we do this training in March, people go, oh no, I've got tomatoes in my fridge, I need to go and check where they were from. But we're okay now. What are we, just into May, you're maybe a little bit off the hook here. So normally, I guess your large salad varieties are quite low carbon. They're grown locally in season. Even things that are flown over or that are on a boat over from Spain are fairly low carbon when they're kind of a large number of produce that's taken over on a boat. It's definitely less than air freighted things if they're taken over on a plane. And yes, in March, if you're getting tomatoes, they're grown in a heated greenhouse, and that's why. That figure is actually a lot higher than a lot of meat, which is still quite shocking, and just goes to show with carbon footprints and energy, it's never as simple as it first seems. It's never meat good, meat bad, veg good. There's sort of no one size fits all. We always say that the answer to everything in this line of work is it depends. And this goes to show there's sort of a lot of different variables that go into it. I've got another one here for travel, which is another very interesting area. So if you were thinking about a return trip from London to Glasgow, and you're using these modes of transport, so I think it's 411 miles each way. And not that I'm expecting anybody to work out a calculator and do a calculation, but the car figure, I believe, is based on 70 miles an hour of driving. And with one person travelling all of the modes of transport, which one do you think has the highest carbon footprint? You will think SUV. Any other guesses? Pop in the chat if you've got a guess. This one, if you've worked on travel before, you might be okay. Might be more familiar with. A lot of good guesses. I'll reveal it here. It was SUV. And can you see the massive difference between SUV and plane? I think it is still quite shocking for the amount that it is. And again, all of that is because, and you might realise is that guessed SUV, because it's the driver only, all the emissions from that one journey are attributed to that one person. If there was 4 people in the car, then when you're doing the calculation, it would be divided between them. And there's, as I say, same with the food, there's a lot of different variables that go into it for travel as well. So even within a plane, when you take into account sort of economy and business class can sometimes be twice the amount because of kind of the larger area needed and the different level of service. So it's never as easy as it first seems. And I think these figures again came from our Weldon data, so it's useful if you're interested in that. You can go on and have a look at loads and loads of other transport forms as well. So just to look at an example of, now we've done that sort of little activity to be aware of kind of all the different variables that are involved. There's also a lot of different variables, I guess, with how that looks locally, and I think it's useful to look at an example. So for, like I say, we're in the East Midlands now. A number of you might not be from Leicester, but I've taken Leicester as an example. And there's a lot of sort of similar actions that have happened for the other councils in the area as well. The Leicester and Leicestershire councils declared a climate emergency and have released an environment strategy that's set across these 6 themes. So I think looking at these areas and how they affect business is still going to be sort of comparable to the other areas in the East Midlands as well. So for the area of home, this is mainly about things like energy efficiency. So where workplaces and businesses can have a big influence is working with their staff to support staff who are working from home to move to green suppliers, which is often, I think, not considered as a big area, but something that workplaces and businesses can really have a huge impact on in terms of emissions. For consumer choices, this is really about sort of the public awareness of the climate impact of buying and disposing of products. And customers are going to expect sort of zero carbon products, and businesses need to be aware of this and stay ahead of this and then what this looks like. For travel and transport, this is about active travel, discouraging single-use car journeys like we saw in the activity. And you can see in Leicester, if any of you are from Leicester, the developments around Town Hall are now favouring walking and cycling, and that's happening more and more in different cities as well, and across Leicester. And this, of course, has different sort of benefits for the individual, for your travel and your health, but also for kind of local communities and emissions and the health of the local area as well. For resource use, for waste and recycling, it's really going to affect things like packaging and also sort of that main focus on reducing waste and reusing. So, for example, if businesses produce products, all items produced by businesses will need to come from sustainable sources. But even if your business doesn't produce products, you're still responsible for material use in some way. And in some sense, sort of focusing on reducing and recycling is still going to be really important. At work, this is about ensuring that training needs are met in order to tackle all of this. We suggest looking at carbon literacy training for this, which I can tell you a little bit about later in the session and point you towards where you can sort of receive a full accredited carbon literacy training. And then lastly, for the biodiversity, habitats and local environment, this is where things like low carbon standard developments come in to sort of the town policies, and being carbon neutral and having net zero targets in place and Businesses in the local area need to start looking at having environmental or sustainability reports if they don't already, because local authorities, for example, businesses may lose out on tenders, for example, with local authorities if they don't have sort of environmental or sustainability reports or commitments. And these are just examples of changes that happen in East Midlands, and local authorities are making these massive changes, and they do have these targets, but they can't achieve them without businesses and residents also working towards these strategies, which means that there's a lot of support from local authorities, from the sort of local area, and from universities as well, in order to sort of help achieve these, because nobody can achieve it by themselves. So what we're going to do is point you towards some resources that we've got that are available for any of you to access as well, and we'll take you through those in a minute. Lastly from me, specifically I guess for organisations of the university, we wanted to highlight, and we do have resources set across these themes as well, but really that energy, buildings and transport are the three main areas that you should be looking to tackle first, really. So that's ensuring that you're using things like renewable energy, that business buildings are insulated and efficient, and that you're thinking about green transport for commuting and business travel as well. And not also sort of forgetting the areas of procurement, supply chain and waste. And like I say, we do have resources that can go into each of these areas as well. You're obviously all going to be experts in that first energy area, but there's a lot of other sort of intersections with different areas that might be useful for you to look at some of the resources that we've got available specifically for sort of businesses in the local area. I'm going to pass over to Sandra now, and then we'll take you through the resources that we've got available.
Thanks, Alice. So I'm going to talk a little bit more on a sort of more specific, hone into what we mean, what businesses can do. And I'm reliant on Alice still doing, I will try and avoid the next slide bit, please, all the time. So we're going to have to get our psychic connection going. So in terms of why businesses should do. At the moment, there's not a lot of legislation around, and we tend to find that the organisations who are the most engaged with this agenda, it's generally because there's some kind of legislation or reporting requirement, or maybe they've just got very engaged customers who want it. But more and more, we're seeing sustainability credentials coming in supplier tenders. Certainly for the university, it's starting to creep into funding requirement. Yeah, we won't be eligible for certain funding pots if we don't tick the boxes. So it's coming, but when we're horizon scanning, we think it's going to come sometime after the next election, the general election, and it might come fast. As certainly as the government gets towards its own net zero target, they're going to start panicking and put it onto us. So that's kind of what we see. The more we can invest now, the more we can get ready for that, and then we'll be ready for any legislation that may come our way. And also, from what we've seen with our own engagement with businesses and also mainly with our suppliers, is just a massive lack of engagement in this area, and particularly around with SMEs that don't have the resources that the big players have. Although having said that, we did some work with our top 10 suppliers and we were shocked at how little they knew about their own environmental impact. And they were the big people that we spend millions with. So, but, you know, as well as avoiding some nasty legislation that may or may not be coming our way. This is about a change movement. It's about getting ready for what's coming. That's the next slide, and hopefully investment in up and coming as opposed to dying industries. You know, it's that thing. So if you move on to the next slide, I don't know how much you're aware of this piece of work that's been done by PwC. If you just Google Green Jobs Barometer, this comes up and you can look at different areas. I think this is fascinating. It's a piece of work that was done last year, and they've got this idea about sunset jobs. So these are jobs that are set to disappear from the workplace by 2030 as a result of the green transition. So, for example, manufacturing diesel engines, being that's the kind of thing that, or even maintaining diesel engines, that's going to become an obsolete task. The frightening thing is that the East Midlands is the second worst part of the UK for this after Scotland. Also I don't know if you've got to hand the reference, Alice, but on a separate piece of work that was done by the government, I think the East Midlands is the least prepared to deal with this. So we're the most affected, one of the most affected areas by the green transition, and the least prepared to deal with it. So Alice, don't do that because you're changing the screen. Don't do that. We'll find the reference for you. So I think I'm amazed that more people aren't talking about this. If we think of 8% of jobs in the region going in the next few years, the economic impact of that is phenomenal. And we need to be looking at what we can do about that, which is now let's just share the screen and forget that. It's Zoom can't cope apparently with slide 20. You can't do anything else. Yeah, that's it. Forward one. So I'm assuming from your awesome answers earlier that I don't have to go through all the different energy scopes, but it can be complicated, and I must admit I have to explain them over and over again to the same people inside the university. So it's a refresher. And for me, it's about this influence, because for the university, is someone else's scopes 1 and 2. So there is that argument that if everyone doesn't always quite work like that. If anyone does want a refresher on the energy scopes or is sick of defining it to other people, then we've produced a video and we'll share a link with you later on that you can share and download. There's also a YouTube version of it because you get fed up of saying the same thing over and over. But really, it's about that sphere of influence. So when, as Alice just said, if we focus on our buildings and on what we can do, we've got direct control over that. After that, it starts to get a bit woolly and a bit tricky. We should still do it, we should still report it. But so the university's approach is very much, we focus mainly on what we've got direct control on, and then as our sphere of influence grows, then it's less of a priority, but it's still important. So back to this carbon neutral business and what that looks like. And it's how you define it, and there's an awful lot. I'll come on to greenwashing in a little bit. I'm very skeptical when a business tries to claim to be carbon neutral, and I went to fill up my car with fuel and was told the petrol I was buying was carbon neutral. Really? So I think we have to take some of these claims with a bit of a pinch of salt. And that's really, I think, for us as experts in this area to drive these definitions and to say, actually, we need to be a bit more ethical in these claims. The context of what that looks like, as we've said, our direct fuel that we use, how we heat our buildings and power them, and what how we get around. These are the things that really matter. These are the big things. Certainly for the university, what we buy is half our footprint. So again, we have no influence, particularly on how those things are produced and developed, although we can work with suppliers, but money talks, doesn't it? So where we spend our money, I think, is a really important piece. So materials bought and used, and actually for me, I would love to get to a stage where I knew the carbon emissions of every product that we bought. Wouldn't that be great? Then you could make a really informed purchasing decision. So I would encourage all businesses to get to that stage where you not only know your overall business environmental impact, but you know the impact of the stuff you're selling, because then we can make much better choices. Of course, the answer to all is just because it's got a low or high carbon footprint doesn't make it better or worse. And it's a factor in terms of all the other ways that we make these purchasing decisions. So when we're talking about carbon neutral or net zero, any stuff like that, and I'm not going to get into the offset debate, but we have to mention it because it is important. As Alice said earlier, you can reach carbon neutral without reducing 1 gram of carbon or any kind of emission by simply paying someone else to offset it for you. Personally, I don't think that's ethical, but you can do it if you want the badge. Also, as we've said, how you define your net zero target. So businesses have these, and local authorities, for example, all have these net zero target dates now, but there doesn't seem to be two that are the same. So we've got a net zero target, but it's quite different in what we count to other universities, and there's no guidance around that. And the government's own net zero plan was taken to court and lost. I would not like anyone to take our net zero plan to court either, but I'm not the government. I put it's not just trees because people always just assume that offset, we'll just plant some trees. And in fact, we did have someone at the university who went, it doesn't really matter, we'll just buy a forest in Scotland and that will offset what the university does. To be fair to the Scottish government, they then brought in legislation to stop people doing that, but not before a couple of universities had done just that. So yeah, there's some interesting piece on that. I did put the Oxford offsetting principles in the chat earlier. That is really that's really strong. That's a sort of standard, like the gold standard for what we should be looking at. And it really can look at this whole, offsetting is about, there's different ways to do it. One thing is about like the sequestration, the carbon absorption of your own land, your own stuff that you do. Another way is to invest in, I always kind of look at it as carbon reduction. There's a low-hanging fruit, there's best bang for your buck. So there's stuff that we can do right now, but then the others, it starts to get more and more expensive for the same kilogram of carbon. So someone's just put, where can you put it? I put the chat earlier, you have to scroll up the chat for the carbon offset. It's the Oxford offsetting principles. If you Google them, they'll come up. So yeah, the other way to do it is to help other people. You can invest in carbon reduction, sort of low-hanging fruit, cheap, best bang for your buck carbon reduction projects elsewhere that aren't within your area, but it still counts. And then, of course, there's investment in carbon removal technology. I love this concept of sucking the carbon out of the air. But this technology is new. There's lots of research going on, and it's underfunded. So there's nothing wrong with that as a piece. So personally, when I'm thinking about net zero, when I'm thinking about the whole sort of this piece, thinking within your own four walls, your own business is inefficient and it's expensive. So I would encourage us not to do that. I think we need to be thinking on a community level, and it's not there. So this is my plea to you guys who are my educated audience. Can we start to change this culture and just figure out what's the most low-hanging fruit, and we'll all just invest in that, because the planet doesn't care where the carbon is saved from, as long as it is saved from somewhere. And I think that's probably an easier way to do it. And I've mentioned greenwashing, and I just think it's quite interesting going through that practice earlier. The highest carbon would be sold as UK produced, the tomatoes, but they're UK produced, they're the best, right? Traveling on a plane. You're the bad person. Actually, that's better than my mum's SUV that she drives on her own. Like, that's the thing. And I think, so that greenwashing thing and people meaning well and people putting different things, I think is really important. And it's one of the main things that we're trying to do with students, to get them to smell greenwash so they can see it, but also to work with businesses so that they don't unwittingly do it. And we've seen this. I was at an event, and someone who produced parts for aeroplanes hadn't considered what they did or who they worked with in terms of their carbon emissions, but they had put some charging points for their staff and considered that job done. like not even considered their products or anything. They just went, well, how many of your staff even drive to work, like, or even have electric vehicles? And that hadn't occurred to them to measure the effectiveness of this. So in terms of when we need to get on with stuff, Alice, can you flick over, please? And what a carbon neutral business looks like. We haven't got one yet. And I don't mean one that's just put a badge on. I think this is a little bit of a depressing, and we will turn the presentation more positive in a minute, but we have to do a quick bleak piece. If we look at that blue line, that's the track that we're on. Is that right? Yeah, and what we need is the red line. So we're a little bit off. So whilst there is some good stuff happening, and we can all claim there's some good stuff and work's going on, and the government will say, oh, we've invested in this, that, and the other, yeah, you're way off to try and actually hit the net zero target, and that's by 2050. And I saw an excellent, don't ask me to find it because it's on LinkedIn somewhere, but 2050 is the new climate denial. Because it feels down the road enough, and hopefully I'll have retired by then and I don't have to worry about it, right? So I'm always a bit skeptical by 2050 target. The universities is 2040, by the way. Just thought I'd get that one in there. So in terms of some practical support, what the university's been doing with other universities, and actually this has happened across the East Midlands. Last year we had some government funding through the Chamber, through the Community Renewal Fund, to work with businesses and help them come up with their own carbon reduction plans. And the first thing we realised was they weren't ready. They weren't even ready for, it was, oh, just produce a template, which we did, but that wasn't the right thing. And we learned that actually getting businesses to even engage and even know what their environmental impact is was the first bit, to even get them to the table, let alone to the stage where they'd actually come up with a plan. So we learned a lot from that. And like I said, for those of you who aren't in Leicester, we worked with Nottingham, Derby colleagues. It was across the piece. So there's some excellent resources out there. I encourage you to, well, if you want your local contacts, just let us know, and we can put you in contact with them if you don't already know. So what we've come up with is a kind of, depends where you're at in your organization. Do you have your numbers? Do you know what you're doing? Can you put your plan together? How engaged are your staff? And then once you've done all that great stuff, tell other people about it, because it's about normalizing it. As we said, in the East Midlands, we're seeing it's not being talked about. It's just not a thing. So we need to make it a thing. And I think that's really important. So is now a good time to share? Do you want me to share what we've got? Alice, when were we going to do that?
You can do it now if you want.
Yeah, if you stop, right, we're doing a little bit of magic here. If you stop sharing, I will start sharing. So what we've produced is that sharing? No, now it's sharing. Is I can share you the link. This hasn't quite been migrated over, so I'm showing you at the moment a test site. So we've got the link, but it's not the final. Timing's wrong, but it's as I signed it off on Thursday. So this will be live. So what we've got is for businesses, depending on where they are on that journey, there are resources. So for example, and this is where those videos are, what carbon jargon is, what energy scopes, just little explainer videos. So we've got lots of resources to help you calculate your carbon footprint, waste audits, just sort of to come up with your environmental impact. And then once you've done that, to lots of, again, loads and loads of resources. You'll see Alice a lot on these because there's a lot of additional training resources that we can use. And then what we have added, as is promised, is a template carbon reduction plan that businesses can download, personalize, and away you go. So we've done the hard work for you. So this all came from the CRF project. It's a university's partnership. So we've got a civic university with the 3 Leicestershire-based universities, and those resources are there for you free of charge. And we will share the link when we share the slides. Hopefully it'll be live by then. So can we go back to the slides? So that was just to let you know the stuff that's available now. And I do know all the universities have various different bits and bobs as well. That's what we came up with. So if you move to the co-benefits. So I think the other thing, and we've been doing some marketing and some sort of comms work ourselves at the university. And sometimes the difficulty with this very doom and gloom, save the planet or we're all going to die, doesn't feel, it's not the best marketing message. So when we really looked at it, and health is up in the top left, because actually health benefits, mental health, physical health benefits, reduced mental stress, reduced air quality issues, those sorts of things, that's the what's in it for me. And I often get this, what's the incentive? Why should I? And sometimes it's difficult to talk numbers and money. People always want to say, oh, if you do this, you'll save money. And sometimes we have to look very long term before the numbers stack up, the investment's worth it, financial investment. But the health benefits can be seen straight away. And I think that's really important. So some of these are pretty obvious. Efficiencies should always be a benefit. So the way that we work together, but also I think working as a community, investment in the green economy. Students ask us all the time, I want to work in sustainability. I want that kind of job. They want that. The youth of today want that. And someone put something in the chat earlier about climate adaptation. We are at 1.2 degrees. All the building regulations, the planning regulations, they're already out of date. They're already obsolete. You only got to see the droughts that we can't cope with in the summer, the floods, everything else. So being resilient, and I am a natural born optimist. You can't do this work if you're not an optimist. But to sound pessimistic for a second, if you are not planning your estate and your business for a 3-degree temperature increase, you're planning to fail. You've got to hope for the best, prepare for the worst when it comes to climate adaptation. That's my unscientific way of looking at it. So that's my take. I'm going to hand back to Alice now.
Yes, I'm just going to quickly round off with a couple of next steps. We've shown you that website where there's a load of resources that you can use. Another thing I think is probably a really important takeaway for you to take away from this. We've given you a sort of introduction here to carbon literacy training, but there is a full 8-hour course. I think it's 8 hours overall. You'd probably do 6 hours in a facilitated session for receiving an accreditation to attend kind of the full carbon literacy training. There is an opportunity, and I have put it on the slides, for any SMEs in the Leicestershire area to attend carbon literacy training for free with a bit of university's partnership work that ourselves and DMU are putting on. That is soon, at the end of this month. So if you are interested, Sandra, I think it's in the notes for that slide. If you can pop the Eventbrite link in the chat. If not, I can put it in there afterwards. I've got it, but if I try and go on anything, as we know, the slides will mess up, but I can do that after. So that is available for free if anybody is part of an SME in the Leicester and Leicestershire area. You can attend that or send it out to anybody that you think might find that useful who is part of the criteria. If you're not and you're still interested in attending carbon literacy training, you can find facilitators on the carbon literacy training website. There's a directory of trainers and facilitators, and you can find and set up local sessions. And that might be something useful for you to do either sort of as an energy institute, as a organisation back at work, or just as an individual to join a kind of community group. I will say as well, when I was having a look, I was looking for specific courses that might be relevant. So there's a kind of base criteria for a carbon literacy course to be accredited. We have sort of made our own ones at the university, and I've been involved in making a sector-specific one for fashion SMEs in Leicester as well, and a general one for SMEs. If you wanted to be involved in setting up a kind of engineering or energy-focused one, that is also possible, as I've sort of done similar things to that before, and the university has useful resources that we can share. I would be happy to help anybody set that up. If you wanted to create kind of bespoke one for engineering or energy sectors, I can work with you, as we've got kind of a lot of base material, and I can help sort of work out whether it's going to sort of hit the mark and help you get it accredited. If that is of use to anybody, feel free to email me and we'll put sort of contact details at the end. Also, if you're interested in kind of a shorter version, carbon literacy training is sometimes a big commitment. But I mean, you saw on the website that Sandra showed you that there's loads of videos on there and resources that you could use for kind of in-house delivery, or different resources for other training as well. So that's not your sort of only option. But essentially, there is a lot of kind of knowledge and resource out there at your disposal. A short little thing I wanted to show you quickly before we finish is a lot of these I think are already on the website that Sandra showed you, which will send you out. Basically a number of different resources that are useful depending on what stage you are in your journey. So the first few of them, kind of up to carbon footprint, are useful for that measure stage. So if you haven't worked on anything else yet, then measure your carbon footprint as a starting point, as an organisation or as an individual. And for larger businesses, kind of further along in your journey to net zero and thinking about some sort of other considerations, these are the resources, science-based targets and WWF emission possible, are going to be useful for that type of thing. Again, all of that is on the website that Sandra showed you. And finally, just before we finished, often when we run these sessions and when we run the full carbon literacy training as well, like Sandra said, we go into the doom and gloom of things, which is difficult not to do because you have to have a little bit of context. But I also like to finish the sessions on positive outcomes that have come from individual and organisational actions. That there's sort of loads and loads of big changes that when you look at the news and when you hear about climate change, you often only hear of the negatives, but actually things like this training and things like individuals like us going out and taking sort of actions in an organisation or as an individual, or through the sort of other things that you're doing through the Energy Institute, does and can and does make massive changes. And there's already been sort of huge waves of changes and positive things, like the things I've shown on the slide. More people are employed in clean energy than in the fossil fuel industry. That's great. And there's lots and lots of other things that are sort of really positive. So it's always nice to finish on the positive actions that have come from things like this instead of onto the doom and gloom. But so the last thing that we wanted to talk about was just if anybody has any questions. I think we've near on taken the hour, but if anybody has any questions, we're happy to stick around for a bit. And we've got our, let me put it on here. I don't have the link to hand, but Sandra, maybe you do, or perhaps I can copy this. Oh yeah, I can. Here you go. So if you wanted to, on that university's partnership website, which is going to be updated with all of the resources that Sandra showed you, there's also a contact form at the bottom. So even if you go on it now, it doesn't have all of the other great stuff, but it still has a contact form. So if you were interested in getting in touch about any of the stuff that we've talked about, there's a contact form at the bottom of there. And if you just do the environmental sustainability on the drop down and it asks who you're trying to contact, then that will come straight through and me and Sandra can help you out that way. Or you can get in touch with Chris Bell, who knows how to get in touch with us as well. And like I say, we're happy to answer any questions now if anybody has any from either in the room or online on the chat.
Thank you very much, Sandra and Alice. That was really interesting. I think, and all of us in the room here were sort of rapt listening to you, so thanks. We can take some questions. I think there's a couple of questions typed in the chat, and I know there's been a few questions in real time, but if anybody else wants to ask a question orally, I think you can unmute yourselves to do that, but if you need me to unmute you, just please send a little chat message or stick your hand up or something like that. So first of all, how about any questions from the room? I'll just get you unmuted there. Okay. Rupert, sorry,
thanks.
you're in a hot seat.
Duncan Chowder, I'm sort of retired now, but I worked in the energy sector all my life. The question is, are the SMEs actually interested in following sort of carbon literacy, carbon neutrality, zero carbon, without any stick from the government like legislation. Because I was doing a lot of this work about 20 years ago, and there was no real interest from SMEs unless they were forced to have to do something. So has that landscape changed now?
I can take that. Well, Alice, do you want to stop sharing your screen? And then we can see things. Yeah, I can take that one. No, it hasn't improved at all. So we've, as through the Civic University Agreement, we've got a piece of work on sustainability skills, so upskilling. And in Leicester is 98% SMEs, so most of our work is around SMEs. And we started the research project in, what skills are required, which sectors, and we asked the wrong question. We realized they were so lacking in any awareness. And actually, it's not a reluctance to do it, it's a reluctance that it even matters. So yeah, that's certainly my take, that the only people who are engaged are the people who've been beaten with a stick. But unfortunately, that stick is coming for example, manufacturing, of which there's a lot in Leicestershire. They're just going to be massive closures. That's where these sunset jobs are, and that's why I think it's our job to start talking about it and saying, guys, when if those of us who are old enough to remember when the mines were closed, and some of the economic devastation that happened in communities, and that's the trouble. This 8% of jobs isn't going to be a uniform. It's going to be some certain areas, and some areas are going to have the same level of economic impact, negative economic impact. But this time we can see it coming. We know who they are. We know where they are. We can do something about it. But we're running out of time. So, you're absolutely right. They're not engaged. I think it's our job to get them engaged and say, guys, this is important. But they need to know solutions. So even the SMEs that are engaged don't know where to go. And there's a wealth of information out there. Where do you start? What do you do? And that's really where, so we've come up with something. We're trying to work with the local authorities, but so once we release it, I'm happy to take advice, because actually there just needs to be a one-stop shop for organisations to go to. What do we need to do? Where do we go for it? And that information is not there. So we're sort of starting with education, that people even understand what it is that we're talking about. It's tricky because what they want to know is, and we always get that, what's the one thing we can do? If there was one thing, we might have mentioned it by now. So yeah, we've got a long way, and it's a steep slope. Alice, there's a question in the chat that I'm going to let you tackle because it's from your slide.
Where? Oh, just to be clear, does Scotland get 97% of energy from renewables, 97% or 90%, 97% of electricity only? Good question. Let me find it in the slide.
That was one of mine, Alice. Just for clarity, it was because quite often people, and I'm not accusing you guys of doing this, but often people say energy when they really mean electricity, because most of our energy is in the form of heat, which is raised by burning gas. So I'd be really happy if Scotland really does get 90%, 97%, or even 90% of its entire energy. That would be great from renewables, but I'm not sure if it's just electricity alone.
I think it's electricity.
I think it probably is, yeah. Okay.
Let me double check it, but good point on using energy instead of electricity.
It's the thing about heat. In this country, we just get so much of our heat from gas.
Yeah, it's electricity.
So I'll pick up the one about SMEs. Yeah, would it be simpler, better and more reliable to put a carbon tax on fuels and on the embodied carbon? Yes, but it wouldn't be a vote winner, would it? And I think for me, part of the problem of why we're where we are, the lack of progress, is because of political setups. This isn't popular. Politicians can only think in 4 years, and putting something like that on wouldn't go down well, would it? I think carbon taxation is where we're going to end up as we head towards the sort of 2050 target. So, I mean, that's again, you know, the more you can reduce your impact now, and unfortunately, it will disadvantage the smaller players who can't afford it. And I think, so yes, it would be simpler, and I suspect that is where we're going to end up. So what can we do to help people when it gets there? Because eventually, yeah, they will just come along with a big stick and beat us all. And it'll be polluter pays. There'll be a polluter pays principle. Comment on comment with some masses. A massive rise in fuel prices, but it didn't dramatically reduce consumption. No. And COVID did, but then went straight back. As soon as things reopened, went straight back. Our emission levels are back to where they were. So even though we now work in a hybrid, actually our travel carbon emissions have halved. Yeah, it's the behaviour. I mean, for me, the infrastructure is what needs to be fixed. You know, we need to decarbonise the grid. We need better transport options. You know, these are the things. There's only so much. Even if you live completely off grid and like a complete, you know, grow your own, self-sufficient, everything else, you're still not going to reduce your own personal carbon footprint down to the levels required to stop that. A less industrialized nation.
Sandra, I think we're losing your sound occasionally.
Oh, I can't hear it now either. Maybe mute yourself, then unmute yourself. Still nothing. She's working on a reset. Well, I suppose that answered it anyway. Any other questions?
I just had a question that I think you can probably tackle, Alice. It's about the idea of mitigation as versus adaptation. I guess a lot of what you've talked about tonight has been about mitigation, but I think you did mention, or Sandra mentioned, the need to adapt to climate change, accepting that, you know, it is happening and it's going to get worse. Can you give us any examples of how the university is thinking about adapting to climate change?
That's a good question. Can we hear you now, Sandra?
I hope so. I've told my son to get off Roblox. I think he's using all my bandwidth. I was like, get off it. There we go. So there's a big piece of work. So, and I did put in the chat, there's a lot to think about. So on the one hand, there's adapting our estate to be climate ready. So everything from the wildlife that we plant, you know, making sure that our lawns don't look barren in the drought for graduation, through to the building fabric that we're looking at. Can our buildings, we just built a big site, the big space park, on a floodplain. So there's a little bit of work to do around that. And even things like making sure there's sufficient tree cover and availability of drinking water and things like that for people on our sites during you know, during different things, so different weather events, making sure that we're practical, but also we send people out. People go across the world for various different reasons. So we need to be mindful of ensuring that they're safe, and in terms of increased impact of weather events and things like that. I mean, they might be going to study that, in which case then we're going to have to. But so in terms of how we insure people, how we get people moved, and actually this did happen. I think it was DMU had a load of students in in the States when the Beast from the East thing happened, and they couldn't get the students home, and it was an absolute nightmare. And the conversation of the sectors, and what do you do, and how do we, okay, at the time you just deal with it as any kind of disaster, but how do we plan for that? So in terms of climate adaptation, it's a conversation that we have all the time when we're doing other things. So we've just updated the travel risk management policy, and this is the first time that we've had the conversation about increased weather events and that kind of stuff. So for a lot of these things, it's about it being part of the conversation, which it never has been before. So in terms of, for example, our mental health policy, I'm doing a presentation next month to the Health and Wellbeing Group about including eco-anxiety on that, because fear of climate change has been shown it's one of the fastest causes of mental ill health in young people. So as a university, we need to address this. We've got a lot of young people. We need to address this. So we're still learning on this. There's a lot to do, but I think people tend to think of climate adaptation as just floods, and it's a lot bigger than that. All the different things that can happen. So basically, you need to have a look at your risk management. That's the way I would look at it. Look at your risk register. Look at your normal risk assessments and add it in there, because that tends to be where that's the policy, that's the procedure you've generally already got, but people aren't thinking about that. And if that helps.
Thank you.
So Sandra and Alice, can I just ask a question around sustainability, which was one of your earlier bullet points, and how we consider the broader issue of sustainability rather than just low carbon. I'll give you a couple of examples. One, I work very closely. I'm trying to develop a technology that's going to take refrigerants out of the economy, as one example, because the refrigerant manufacturers, their solution to F-gas policy regulation is to produce a low GWP refrigerant, but it's not sustainable. It breaks down into products which are very harmful. The manufacturer of those products releases CFCs potentially. So their solution seems to resolve climate change, but actually it creates a number of other problems on the side. The other one that springs to mind is plastic bags. We've all been told we don't want to have plastic bags. We're all buying these tote bags. Apparently you need to use those 20,000 times to have them, because of their carbon impact, because of the way that they're manufactured. So could you just comment on the broader picture of sustainability and how we should take that into account when we're reducing our own carbon footprint?
Delighted, excellent question. Something that we come across all the time. Yeah, the vilification of plastics and the idea of people coming into and using single-use glass, really high carbon, high energy to produce and move, instead of what is very much a low energy, low anyway, it's a whole thing. So I've put in a link in the chat, and I don't know how much you're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. We use that as a framework in the university to talk about and to set the context of what we mean by sustainability, and it does exactly that. So apologies if you're really familiar with this, but it's 17 goals. It's the blueprint for how we're going to make the world a better place, and these goals are often depicted as a Rubik's Cube. So those of you who and Rubik's Cubes are having a resurgence now. So I'm not just showing my age. Generation Z is now also into the whole Rubik's thing. But the whole point of it is you can't do one side at a time. It all comes together at the end. You can do the one side, but often it messes up the others. The algorithm doesn't work like that. So that's the way the Sustainable Development Goals are. You have to do them all together. So yes, you might have a low waste solution, but it can be high energy. that some of these things don't work if they then add to social injustices and inequalities and those sorts of things. So that's the approach that we use at the university. The other thing I like about the SDGs is that there's something there for everyone. So even people who say, oh, I'm not in, you know, my work's too important, or sustainability is the one we get is sustainability is really important for other people to do. Like, but of course, I've got to take this flight. My work is this important. I've got, you know, this moral offsetting piece that we get this all the time. You know, what's the benefit for me? I don't want to save money for someone else. It's going to cost me more. All those sorts of things. But if you put that framework up, there's always something that people are interested in that connects with their values and their personal bit. So that's, I think, it becomes a really useful way to frame the conversation. And I have to say, some people are grabbing it more than others, but what you'll see now is a lot of large companies, ourselves included, that will report our sustainability in the framework of the goals. So we produce a Sustainable Development Goal report, what our contribution is to the goals. And we're part of a sector body that reports into this as well. In fact, we just submitted it on Friday, what we do for our teaching and research. So there's some mapping on that. So that would be my answer to sustainability, is look at the goals. Every university, every country signed up to them as well, because it happened in 2015 before politically things weren't difficult. I'm not sure it would happen now, but does that answer that question?
Very good answer, yeah.
Yeah, it does. Thanks very much. I think we're going to draw it to a close. I'm conscious that there is a question that was typed in by John about SMEs having to work out their carbon footprint, but I think you've already tackled that one already. I think there was a comment on the idea of carbon taxes on fuels. So unless anybody else has any more questions, either verbally or typing them in. There's one, there's a new one at the bottom, sorry, yeah. Oh, no, there's not, okay. I think I'll say, on behalf of everybody in the East Midlands Energy Institute, thank you very much to Alice and Sandra. That was really useful, thanks a lot. And as I mentioned earlier, the slides and the recording of tonight's presentation will be available probably sometime next week on the Energy Institute, the East Midlands part of the Energy Institute website. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.